Yeah, thank you, Julie, for the introduction, and thank you to all of you who are joining us tonight for this webinar. For those that have never attended one of my webinars, I will start with a very brief introduction. I have a background in animal and equine science with a specialization in equine nutrition and behavior. And particular after I graduated for my undergrad studies in the Netherlands, I actually moved to New Zealand, where I did some work in racehorses, looking specifically at the effect of dietary transition from pasture to grain feeding and back, and how that influenced the gut health and microbes, and particularly the onset of the disorders such as hindgut acidosis and laminitis, something that we will touch on briefly in this presentation as well. So after my master's, I moved to Australia and founded MB Equine Services, which is an education and research business that is now integrating that nutritional component much more with pasture management and property design, because I came across different issues in Australia compared to Europe, where we house horses much more. So we have a much more controlled way of feeding horses. So my introduction to Australia was a really kind of opening a passion of mine to get more up to date and get more information about pastures. But even beyond that, looking into property design and plants of other species such as your shrubs and your trees. We did a webinar on that a while back. And from that, I think a lot of my strategies, such as permaculture, equine permaculture, originated kind of from that, to kind of use these principles in an integrated way. And there's many other techniques that I also touch on. However, in this presentation, we are going to focus much more on the nutritional component, although I will give a few points on if you are lucky and can make pasture hay or legume hay, I will highlight a few tips on that. But the main focus of this presentation is choosing hay for your horses. And so we're going through a few of important topics, and I think I will, because there's a lot of questions always about carbohydrates, and I will spend a bit of time on that, trying not to go in too much detail, but link it so much to, for instance, your hay analysis or feed analysis that you may have on certain types of fiber products as well. So we may go over the 30 minutes, and at the end, if we have time, we will do the Q&A, as Julie mentioned. So the horse is a non-ruminant grazing herbivore adapted to eating a plant fiber or forage-based diet, and they eat a wide range of plant species that can either be hydrolyzed or fermented. So hydrolyzation of feed is happening in the first part, the foregut, and your fermentation happens in the hindgut of the horse, where there is a mix of microbial symbiotic population that helps with the breakdown of particularly these fibers. So that's where the main part of your fiber digestion takes place. We know that from research that if you look at grazing horses, but also feral horses, that on average, horses spend around 10 hours, but upper of 15. Some have even recorded 18 hours a day of foraging, and that largely depends on the environmental conditions, the food availability, and obviously we're quite aware that in a natural situation they will roam, they will travel significant distances. And so if you look at the time budget, you can see that foraging is typically at least half, if not more, of their budget, and then there's a few other behaviors. Obviously, we've departed from nature in a way that we have currently more of a purpose for horses along the lines of for leisure, for sporting. Historically, probably much more working horses, carriage horses, working on the land. We still obviously use horses on farms, but the majority is probably in as a hobby and a hobby for hobby or for sporting purposes. And what we know is obviously that as we are managing horses on in different areas around the world, often horses are stabled, often there's not enough pasture availability. Even here in Australia, while there is more horses, large percentage of horses. When I did a survey for my PhD, it was around 70% of horses are managed here on. However, the size of those pastures will vary large, from massive hectares to, you know, obviously much more smaller acreage, small block where horses may have to be stabled. And so with that, it's obviously a need that if we have limitation of not enough availability of pasture on a 24-hour time budget, that we have to look at preserved forages, typically your hay, other fiber sources, haylage, and that is something that we're going to focus on today. The question that most people have is what, in respect to these type of feed products, what is the quality and how suitable are these preserved forages for my horses? So considering how it's produced, the nutritional content, how well is it digested, but often people forget the hygiene of these as well, and more often, and most importantly, how much should I feed? So to begin, before we go into which type of forage would be most suitable, we actually have to go first to the requirements of the horse. So it starts with evaluating the nutritional requirements, and often we see that horse owners copy feeding regimes from other horse owners, or they get tips from their instructor, and so without actually being very doing a bit of research on their own horses, and also looking into like scientific information, or delving probably a little bit in some of the information that feed companies may put out in what is required for my horse, what is the maintenance requirements of my horse, and then looking at the activity. So it's maintenance plus activity often when we deal with requirements for exercising horses or performance horses. And there's also a lot of discrepancy, I think, in how horse owners may determine if they do light exercise or heavy exercise or medium exercise. And so that is important to level and get some idea of how much, where your horse sits and how much you should feed on a daily basis. So how we do that is based on nutrient requirement that's been established from research on nutrition and feeding of horses, and this has been conducted over probably 50 years, if not more. And there's different nutritional requirement references around the world. France has its own system, the Netherlands has a system, but on an international basis we use the NRC, which is the National Research Council, and they published and then they a few books on the nutrient requirement of horses. There are 6 editions currently. The 6th edition was published in 2007, and we still use that information to determine the nutritional requirements of horses as nutritionists. But there may be other systems that nutritionists may use, as well as recent research that add to it. I put the link in the bottom here, so if you want to know more specifically some of the breakdown, and there's actually a free source, so that's the link. So just note that, and if you want to kind of play with that, it's a free system, little computer program that you can use. So as I mentioned, horses are now used for sporting, and so we want to kind of look at what kind of requirements are required for these type of horses. So I've put here a little bit the breakdown in total feed a day. So I don't go into what is the crude protein levels that a horse needs or the energy levels. As I said, there's a bit of information going through this little feed program. But what is important in relation to the forage component is looking at the total feed. So when we look at maintenance, research has shown that horses voluntarily take somewhere between 1.5 to a little bit over 3% of their body weight in dry matter a day. But we have recorded with some pony species that they can go up to 4% of their body weight. And so if you take the maintenance of, for instance, a 500k horse, that means that in total, that horse will need approximately 10 kilograms of dry matter. I give here a bit of a range because it depends a little bit if it's a good doer or if it's a hard keeper, and that will determine if you have to be on the upper end or maybe you have to reduce your total feed intake slightly. The amount of preserved forages in the ranges should be, or total feed should be calculated or should be estimated in dry matter rather than the percentage of the ration or as fat. And that is because of the variation in dry matter content of different feed types of, and typically also your forages. So that's why nutritionists always talk about on a dry matter content. And also if you look at any feed products, ideally you want to have that on a dry matter content rather than on as fat basis. But that aside, it's important to know for what are the minimum requirements when it comes to forage feeding. So research has shown that at least 1.5, initial advice was only 1%, so 50% of the total intake. But we now know that preferably for health reasons and for gut health and behavioral and also for natural behavior, is that we at least need to see 1.5% of the body weight in minimum forages on dry matter content. And absolute minimum is 1.25%. And that may only be when you want to consider some extreme weight loss programs. But again, that should be well monitored, and that needs to ideally be done under veterinarian supervision with appropriate, balancing with supplements. Also, research has shown that foraging behavior should be at minimum of 8 hours, but preferably, as I showed you with the feral horse time budget, around 10, around 10, 24 hours, if we can. If you are having horses in doing a certain activity, such as obviously working or growing, the percentage of dry matter per day will go up. And you can see that when you look at lactation, it can go up to one of the highest values, which is 3%. And work is around, depending on the level, up to 2.5, but can also go over it. And it all begins with establishing maintenance diet and then add to it to see how the horse obviously responds to it. And the main indicator is obviously body condition, something that you visually can observe. The weight is another one, although a lot of people don't necessarily have a scale at home for horses. So body condition is probably the most easy and also a very good indicator if the amount of feed you're feeding your horse with, pasture or fully on forages and additional concentrate provides a good outcome in a certain body condition score. So as you can see here, this score goes from, that I'm showing here, is scaled from 1 to 9, which is the Hanneke scale of body condition scoring. There is some other publications that use a scale from 1 to 5. Again, it will sit somewhere in the middle range for instance, your ideal weight. So here at the bottom, you see your moderate condition score. So moderately thin is a 4, moderate is a 5, and then moderately fat is a 6. And anything above 7, we believe 7, 8, and 9 is not preferred, and anything below, obviously, from 3, 2, and 1 is not ideal as well, because that's poor condition obviously horses will be starving and not getting enough nutrients. On the other end, horses with obesity can develop equine metabolic syndrome, can develop laminitis. Not necessarily, but there is a link between weight gain and potentially developing metabolic disorders. Then now let's go into our forages. So we are very aware that forage products or roughages are very important for our horses. I highlight at least 1.5% of the total intake should be in forages, if not more. If you're not doing much with your horse, it should pretty much be the whole 2%. And anything additional could be added with concentrate, but can also be added with forages. And I'll go into the nutritional content a little bit later. But I think there's often a bit of confusion between what are roughages and forages. So I just wanted to show that roughages are high fiber feeds that we consider crop residues and byproducts. So these could be your straws, could be your cereal hulls, but also, for instance, beet pulp is also a byproduct of a crop. Forages are also high fiber feeds obtained by cutting and preserve, but they are obtained by cutting and preserving the whole plant except the root. So that is typically your lucerne, your haylage, and your hay that we consider as forages. But although they are defined different products, the word forage and roughage are typically used interchangeable. So we kind of use them together, but it's good to know how we divide them. And from a behavioral aspect, the term foraging encompasses all feed intake activity of horses, both on pasture or in housing situations. So let's go to the type of fiber sources. Let's focus first on our forages. There are two types of plant families that are most common. So you have your grasses and your legumes. So grasses include also cereals, because cereals are grasses, but they have edible seeds. Whether grasses or your meadow grasses are typically grasses that don't have edible seeds. These then can be processed in different ways, and that is kind of where the presentation comes in. So you have your hay or your straw. You have your chaffs, which are your finer cuts. So the hays and straw are your longer stem forages. Chaff is typically the same, but then cut into smaller pieces, and that can again be a shorter cut or a longer cut. And then you have your haylage and silage, which means that it's been made airtight and it's fermented, and I will go into that a little bit more. And then you have your cubes, probably not as popular here, but definitely very popular in Europe. Then something that obviously over the years and also with drought and challenges of environment, where we may not be able to harvest enough of our cereal or our grass or legume hays or chaffs, or make chaff or haylage, we are interested to supplement our fiber sources with what we call alternative sources, such as your super fiber. We call them the super fibers, and you can see here beet pulp. I have rice hulls there, soybean hulls, and for instance copra meal, which is an extract of your coconut production. And all of these are fiber sources that can be used. But they all can differ in obviously the nutritional profile. And so when we talk about one of the questions that people ask is what defines the quality of forages or fiber sources. And for instance, if we focus now mainly on our forages, because those are probably the most variable, these are like grass species, obviously, the type. So you're dealing with your C4, your C3s. Obviously, you have leguminous plants versus your grass plants. Digestibility, the leaf to stem ratio. These are all factors that can influence the nutritional value. And the environmental factors should be also considered, so your soil, your rainfall, and that will all determine also how the plant is growing. And the maturity has a very significant influence on the nutrient value, and that is kind of depicted here in the graph. So as the plant matures, the plant gets a higher part of dry matter, and that will then decrease the energy values as well as the protein, the digestible energy components, and the digestible protein in the forage. So that, in relation to haymaking, it is very important to notice at which stage you may want to cut your hay to get a certain nutritional profile. So if you want to have a high quality, you cut early, and that may be very useful for horses with a higher energy requirement versus horses that are having a low requirement, lower energy requirement, and you want to have maybe a little bit more mature cut. So what we call your late stage growth, late vegetative growth. However, as you can understand, as more dry matter and as the plant, what we call, lignifies, the palatability of your forages also goes down, and that can also be quite of concern, because there's nothing worse than that you buy a lot of hay or chaff, and the horses are not really liking it. So obviously there is this balance between palatability and nutritional value on the end when you come to the end of that growth phase. Storage techniques have also an influence on this, and I will go to that in more detail when we talk about haylage and silage. And also contamination with weed species can also affect obviously the palatability, the safety, what we call hygiene safety of your forage, and the nutritional quality as well. So if you are lucky and you are having enough pasture availability where you're setting paddocks aside for haymaking, these are some things that you want to consider. And if you want to also be kind of on the end of pasture management, doing soil tests and making some links between that and the nutritional value once you've harvested, can be very helpful. If we then look at, let's put a few of these type of forages in a bit of an overview of nutritional value. So if you have your hays versus your legume hay, so obviously lucerne is a very popular one, and then you have your oats and your wheat and chaff. So I put here some of your common feed products that horse owners use, and you can see that when you look at your lucerne, you have a typically higher nutritional profile, particularly your protein, and what we call the sugars, the carbohydrates. I will go into that a little bit in more detail. Can vary a lot, but often these are a little bit less than some of your improved pasture species, such as, for instance, if you had a ryegrass hay. Here's, for instance, have your meadow hay that is typically a little bit lower. If you look at your cereal chaffs, they typically have a higher energy profile, but they are higher in sugar as well. And so it's important to know these kind of differences in relation to, which one should I choose for, my laminitic horse, or which one should I choose for my, broodmare. This is only giving a bit of a range, and you don't really know what the nutritional value is unless you actually analyze it. And different from feed products like in a bag, like your concentrates, hay unfortunately doesn't come with a label unless it is a commercial production of, for instance, your haylage that comes in packages, as you can see here. So a quick view or quick note on what's the difference between your hay and straw versus your hay versus haylage and silage, and that has to do with the preserving method. As I highlighted, the nutritional value can be influenced by preserving method, and that is shown here. So your hay is what we call is air dried and has a low humidity, and typically has a high dry matter content, at least 85% or more. When you look at your haylage and your silage, there is these typically are cut, not fully air dried. So haylage is not fully air dried and is then wrapped in plastic, made airtight so that it can be that it can have a bacterial fermentation that uses up some of these sugars and preserves it in that way. So there's a little bit of acidity then happening, and that kind of preserves it. So it's and in a way you can then store it for longer. And it's a common type of forage that is used in Europe. And silage is when it is even cut much more with a greater water content, not air dried at all, and that's pretty much up to 50%, and anything above 50 and 85 is what we consider haylage in an airtight package. As you can see in the bars beside it, the sugar content will drop as you go into this fermentation process. So the more fermentation, the less sugars, because these are used up, and the greater the lactate is being produced. This is that is causing the acidity, and therefore then the pH is a little bit gets lower. What we see is that typically these type of forages have a bit of a higher nutritional profile because they are preserved, so they're not oxidized and not exposed to air. Typically they keep their nutrients a little bit better, but on the other hand, you have a little bit more problems with the hygienic quality. So mold and mycotoxins can be typically an issue in haylage. Not to say that is not something that also can happen obviously in your hay. If you had hay that became wet and you buy that and you then store it, you may have experienced that it goes moldy. So it's not to say that hay cannot get spoiled, but haylage, if it's not packet right or the holes in it, then it can go moldy, and also mycotoxins can be an issue in large bales. Can be an issue with botulism. So if a bird gets caught in that, and it's kind of brewing in there, it can also cause botulism. So there's a few things that to be considering. Haylage and silage, definitely silage is not really popular here. Haylage is getting more of a trend here, but again, more overseas we are using these type of products, but they can be very beneficial in relation to your performance horses and indoor horses, because there's less dust as well, and so horses with respiratory issues may benefit from these this kind of haylage product. But the bulk of it will be less. So obviously, for horses with metabolic issues or that are weight, you may want to kind of think much more about your drier forages that can increase the bulk but not the calories. Then a little bit more about carbohydrates, because that will determine a little bit more about when it comes to if you are able to do analysis. But it's also good just to in relation to when you consider types of hay, what are we dealing with in forages? What are we consider carbohydrates? So it's a collective name for starches, sugars, and also your dietary fibers. So we can actually define it in two major categories. So your structural, so that's the fiber. That's what we call the cell wall, typically, of the plant. and then you have the content inside, which makes the plant makes sugars and then stores it as well and utilizes it for growth. And this is where your non-structural carbohydrates are defined. So your sugars, your starch, and your fructans. Your structural carbohydrate components, so the fiber part, as I mentioned, is obviously determined by the stage of maturity. So there is more fiber put on the plant when it gets older. So that's what we call lignification. And I'll show you a little bit of a diagram about that. What are the components of the cell wall, and what is the components of these structural carbohydrates. And then you have your non-structural carbohydrates, which is what kind of associate with the cell content. And here's a good diagram of that. So storage carbohydrates are typically your starches and your simple sugars. So these are all kinds of chains of sugars. So your glucose, fructose, those kind of types of sugars, and your fructans as well. And these are stored in the plant in different regions. There is more storage, so obviously in the roots, but it's in the cell, particularly in the chloroplast, that these carbohydrates are stored. So the chloroplast is your little is where photosynthesis takes place, and that is where what we call the carbohydrate factory. And if you're not aware, plants make carbohydrates from sunlight and water and carbon dioxide. So when these come together in the chloroplast, they can create these carbohydrates. This, in relation to knowing your carbohydrates, why I want to spend a bit of time on it is in relation to your analysis. Because if you are sending your hay away, or even your pasture away for analysis, you may get something back like this. So here we had 4 types. So we had a native pasture hay, we had a C4 green panic hay, or wheat hay, and we had our lucerne hay, just to show you the different values. Here on the left, you will see the first 3 rows. It says some neutral detergent fiber and acid detergent fiber, and then you have your lignin. These are all components or ways of how we can analyze your fiber component. When we go a little bit further down, you can see ethanol soluble carbohydrates, water soluble carbohydrates, and sometimes starch is also included in this analysis. Those are components that can give us an indication of certain types of sugars. And these are things that you may want to, kind of indicate in your hay. If it's, for instance, for performance horses, or on the other end, if you're dealing with very sugar sensitive horses and you need to find a good fiber source or a good hay source that you can feed to the type of horses. Obviously, other ingredient or other components such as your minerals, your trace minerals, and obviously the total dry matter content and protein is also included in your analysis. So if we then just have a brief look at the plant carbohydrates, and I wanted to show this diagram because it's a nice overview of what the cell content contains in sugars and what we consider your cell wall content, and in how that relates then to those analysis those analysis terms, those type of techniques that we use to kind of determine these type of sugars. So if we look at first on the fiber side, so let's look at the cell wall. The 3 major components that you have in your in the cell wall. So we have a primary cell wall, and then we have a secondary cell wall. If you look at the plant cell, and in the secondary plant cell, in both of them, we find hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin, but they are more in higher quantities in the secondary one. And that makes the structure of the plant, and that makes the plant quite rigid and allows water to go through the plant. And that's something that where when you are talking about lignification, it is that hemicellulose and cellulose is kind of being replaced by lignin, and that is why the plant is getting from kind of a bit more of a softer feel to that really rough kind of brownish, much more sturdier feel. So, and that is where, for instance, your ADF and your NDF that you saw in the previous. So let's go back to your NDF and your ADF come from. So that will determine your fiber component. So if we look at here, you can see that when we looked at native hay, the fiber, the values are much higher than when you look at, for instance, your lucerne hay. Lignin is also a little bit higher compared to, for instance, your primary lucerne in this example. However, it's still reasonably low. That means that it was a reasonably lower earlier cut. So it was not at the end of the maturity of harvest, at the mature end of the plant growth when it was harvested. If we then go to the cell content, and I think that often horse owners really would like to know in relation to their, sugar sensitive horses, and there's a lot of terms, and especially if you're going on a Google search about non-structural carbohydrates, water-soluble carbohydrates, and ethanol-soluble carbohydrates that are on these analyses. So I just wanted to show you that when we talk about non-structural carbohydrates, we actually, in this graph, you can see that we are talking here about mono and oligosaccharides and the starches. And that is what we call, that the oligo and mono and oligosaccharides and disaccharides are what we call water-soluble carbohydrates. And plus starch together, we term that as non-structural carbohydrates. If you then go to those kind of what we call the simple sugars, so your mono and disaccharides and oligosaccharides, they can actually be divided again into your smaller components, what we call your ethanol soluble carbohydrates, and then you have to add your fructans to that. So those are the blue circles that are put around it. So that is determined by your ethanol. So the monosaccharides and the oligosaccharides can be determined by your ethanol soluble technique, and then you add your fructans to it. So and those kind of terms can be quite confusing, and overall what nutritionists mainly highlight in advice is that we talk still in the broad term of non-structural carbohydrate. But if you want to really be specific, certain indicators of your these specific simple sugars are probably more of a better indicator in relation to determining if something is high in sugar or not. But for the probably overall and keeping it a bit simpler, we still consider the non-structural component as the indicator of if something is suitable or not suitable. And typically we want to have something below around 10%, 12%, or below that in dry matter when it comes to feeding horses and ponies with, for instance, equine metabolic syndrome or laminitis. So under the term of laminitis safe, anything below 10 typically is what we consider as a safer forage or fiber source for these type of horses. So and that is, I think, the most important takeaway message. If you really want to know a little bit more, you want to kind of really dissect a little bit better these sugars, because some indicate a little bit more what we call your simple sugars that may cause a much more glycemic glycemic response in horses that are obviously not good, that those are not good for horses that are at risk. Other other fiber sources that that we can add, and probably people may have added in lack of hay availability or the prices of hay, typically obviously lucerne hay and even meadow hay, where we are paying what, at least 30, sometimes 30 or even more dollars per bale, can be very hurtful. So obviously a lot of people may have already looked into other fiber sources, and a few of them are listed here. So for instance, your copra meal, so that's your coconut extract. These are typically lower in these non-structural carbohydrates, but it can be ranging from 6 to 15%. The digestibility is typically really good, so it can provide good energy. It's high in oils, high in fat, and it's a safe food typically for these kind of challenging, horses with that are sugar sensitive or challenged with like with laminitis. But it is also a really good source for performance horses as well, because of that fat content, where you have to be a bit cautious to overfeed that with if you have fat ponies, or you want to reduce weight. Also, your oil and seed and legume hulls is very popular. Obviously, one of those is your soybean hulls, but also sunflower seed hulls can be used. And these are typically also lower because the actual cell content has been removed, and you're really dealing only with the husk. And so these are typically also lower in non-structural carbohydrate. The digestibility of it is typically lower because you're dealing with the outer wall only. Sugar beet pulp is a very good replacer, also for bulking up the fiber content. It's low in sugar, low in non-structural carbohydrates. It has a good calcium content, and the digestibility is really good. And you're looking at digestible energy up between 11 and 13, but again, there may be a bit of variety of type of fiber product, beet pulp, that you may get. Typically, these products come in a bag, and these manufacturers will have to list some basic information on it. So like your digestibility, your crude protein, your digestible energy, crude protein be on there. And often these will also advertise that they are low in sugars. And so you will have to be very aware of that if you are dealing with laminitic horses, that it's below this 10%. So again, make sure that you read these labels, and if they are not on there, you could potentially question these producers if they have an analysis of their product. Or if you game, you can obviously do your own analysis to check if the company if this product actually is what it says on the label. These can be used obviously in your mixes, can be added to as a replacement of grain, to bulk up the diet, and it can be also a replacer, partially, not fully, of some of that forage component of say 1.5% of the body weight, or even 2%. If you would like to kind of reduce that a bit, say 0.5% could come from these fiber sources, but it will be quite a lot of bulk, and a lot of these products will have to be dampened because they swell. So make sure that you read the label, and make sure that you are not introducing these feeds if you have never fed these in large quantities. Make sure that your horse adapts to these type of fiber sources, and that actually counts also for forages, so such as your haylage, and if you even silage, or it's much more rarer here, but definitely haylage, or different type of species hay, such as your millet hay, if you never fed that, or some of your different type of hays that have been popping up, like teff hay and things like that. make sure that you do it in small quantities to make sure that the horse obviously adapts to it and doesn't get any upset. But it's also often a palatability issue as well. So stick to it, because horses are quite neophobic, so they don't really like new foods often, and so they need at least 3 to 5 days to get used to it. So you have to kind of commit to it a little bit, or mix it with some of your other feeds. In relation to sugar sensitive horses, I think I addressed most of it, but just kind of a summary of the tips. See if you can get your low GI forages, so less than 10%, less than 12% of the dry matter content in non-structural carbohydrates. Think about getting hay in that later stage. Typically, if you have a sugar sensitive horse, analysis of hay is actually really required. But if that is not always possible, or financially possible, then soaking hay or steaming hay may help with reducing some of the sugar levels. There's a lot of research out there that gives some recommendations on how to do it, how long to do it, because there again is a bit of a hygiene issue if you have it in too hot water and then sitting for too long. And also some of the nutrients may leak as well. So important is not to feed then the water to the horses. And so water obviously in drought can be a bit of an issue. So steaming may be another option, steaming hay. Again, there's a bit of research on there how much of the sugars, may how much sugar may be reduced, but again, unless you do analysis, you don't really know, and so it's a bit of a bit of a guessing game. But it definitely can help. But the amount may be a few percent to much more, like up to 10%. So it's something to test, but ideally you want to do it in combination with your analysis if you really want to do a good job in relation to making sure that your horse is not getting too much sugars. Obviously, monitor body condition and weight. Think about supplementation. So especially if you're reducing some of that fiber content below 1.5%, you have to kind of do that in combination with the supplementation. So making sure that it gets still the nutrients and minerals. And I recommend that you do that with a nutritionist or under veterinarian supervision, because you may even, in extreme cases, you may even want to consider some of the medication. And metformin is one that is currently popping up a lot. And there's a bit of research on that that's showing that there's in large quantities or in a certain amount that there may be some benefit in it's diabetic drug for humans, that it may actually work as well in horses, but there may be some variation in how well horses respond. But discuss that with your veterinarian, and also do some research on this topic in relation to the recent publications on that. And then last but not least, we want to also, with the forages, we also want to kind of make sure that we encourage the foraging behavior. So think about your feeding times. Make sure that you stretch the times. As I mentioned, ideally we want to have horses grazing at least 5 hours, if not 8 to 24 hours, and you can use long stem hays to slow down eating rather than having a lot of chaff. Variety, offer both different types of hay to keep horses occupied. Slow feeding, we've addressed that, or has been addressed quite often in webinars. And it's important that you then also review your, additional feeds overall. Well, as I said, it was a bit longer. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take questions if there is time.